Welcome to today's LaRouche Organization show for Saturday, July 30th. Today's show is entitled Suddenly the Truth, Ukraine and the Ibykus Principle. On July 14th, representatives of the Ukrainian government issued a blacklist, originally including 78 names and later over just 70 names, including 30 participants in previous conferences held by the Schiller Institute. Those conferences included titles such as "There Can Be No Peace Without the Bankruptcy Reorganization of the Dying Transatlantic Financial System," "We Need a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations, Not a Strengthening of Geopolitical Blocs," "Conference to Establish a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations," and 100 Seconds to Midnight on the Doomsday Clock, "We Need a New Security Architecture." Apparently, these representatives of the Ukrainian government found these conferences to be filled with what they called information terrorists. Now, the list as an entirety included people such as former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, journalist Glenn Greenwald, and Senator Rand Paul. But number 2 listed on that list was Schiller Institute founder Helga Sepp-LaRouche, and in fact, the first 30 people on the list had all engaged in dialogue in the virtual symposiums that the Schiller Institute had been holding over the past years. Andrei Shapovalov, the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation, had spoken at a conference in Ukraine July 14th, where he termed those opposing the accepted Ukraine narrative to be information terrorists. And on that occasion, he said, "Information terrorists should know that they will have to answer to the law as war criminals." Now, what was important is that when he gave this speech, some of the organizations that were present at the time he gave the speech included the U.S. Civilian Research and Development Foundation, the National Cybersecurity Cluster, and the event was as a whole held with the support of the United States State Department. Now, the involvement of the United States State Department poses an interesting question, especially considering the implicit threat issued against not only the American citizens that were there and as well as international citizens, but American candidates for elective office as well. For example, there are 2 candidates, Diane Sare and Jeff Young, who are on that list, and we're going to be hearing from them shortly. As whistleblower Scott Ritter, who is also on that list, pointed out in a letter that he wrote of protest to Senators Chuck Schumer and Christine Gillibrand, he said, "As a constituent whose name has appeared on a so-called blacklist published by the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, my personal and professional life has been and continues to be detrimentally impacted by the chilling effect of being labeled a Russian propagandist for simply exercising the right to free speech guaranteed by the United States Constitution. Moreover, Ukraine has a history of converting blacklists of this nature into kill lists, where those who speak out against the policies of the Ukrainian government are being murdered or threatened with violence. I am certain you agree with me that Congress cannot be in a position where, through its actions, foreign governments are provided the means to intimidate citizens of the United States from exercising their constitutionally protected rights regarding free speech." On Thursday, July 28th, a group of independent-minded writers, journalists, and thinkers, most of them actually included on the original list, but others as well, began circulating the following response to this. And it said, "We, the participants in various conferences of the Schiller Institute, are accused of promoting Russian propaganda on a list posted by the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, which is officially part of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, operating under the authority of the president. In times of war, publishing such a list is tantamount to targeting individuals. It is all the more unacceptable that the list agglomerates the names of many speakers representing top institutions from around the globe with diverse opinions who are involved in a dialogue searching to arrive at peace in the interest of all. To assume that such a wide array of speakers are all Putin agents and can't think for themselves can only be explained by belief in conspiracy theories or as mere vulgar propaganda or both. key question is whether the listed speakers are promoting viewpoints consonant with the truth. Normally, this would be up to an audience to decide, but the US NATO efforts to blacklist those that would offer any alternative narrative on Ukraine until now remains unchallenged. So hats off to Ukraine for providing a handy list of speakers who voice different ideas. Those actually interested in finding out the truth will now be better able to compare the official story, the quote narrative, with an uncompromised critique and determine which can bear close scrutiny and decide for themselves which analysis is closer to the truth. So what we're going to do is to bring you now a discussion with a couple of the people that were on that list. I know that Diane Sayre's with us. I don't know whether Jeff Young is there or not, but if so, I'd like to go to Diane first and then to Jeff.
Yes, I'm
Hi.
here. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are able to be heard.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Excellent. Well, I just would like to reiterate some of the points that were made by Scott Ritter, and obviously there's more on this Schiller Institute list. And I know he went on to make the point that I am a candidate against Chuck Schumer. So it is a legitimate question if Schumer was funding the Ukrainian government, which is now acting to meddle in the elections in the United States, specifically by targeting for arrest for war crimes a candidate running against Schumer. I think this is extremely significant. Beyond that, I would just say to all of the listeners of this program and people who have been supporters of Lyndon LaRouche for years, it's worth considering that of the 72 names currently on this list, the first 30 are of the speakers at a Schiller Institute conference, and realize the implications of that we are clearly the most feared agency, the most feared potential force in the world to address what is not Ukraine. I mean, there are Nazis in Ukraine, but who sponsored them? Who trained them? How did they get there? This was an operation which we know goes way back, but certainly at least until 2014, where Sir Richard Dearlove, the employer of Christopher Steele of the famous Dodgy dossier, going through Russiagate and former President Trump's alleged relationship with Russia, and who sent about 100 letters to Victoria Nuland advising her on overthrowing the Ukrainian government. I don't know if he told her to hand out Hostess Twinkies or crumpets to the violent demonstrators in the Maidan, which were hailed by then President Obama and others in the US Senate as peaceful demonstrators fighting for democracy, when they were setting police on fire and attacking parliamentarians with baseball bats. And I think this is a model that people might wish to consider when they're supposedly interested in investigating the events of January 6th. So the US State Department, the British GCHQ were involved in fomenting a coup in Ukraine to bring in a regime that was sympathetic to leftover Nazi elements associated with one of the most violent Hitler collaborators, Stepan Bandera. Obviously, this would not be perceived kindly by Russia. And obviously, there were many people in Ukraine, which is a very mixed group because of the history of Ukraine and Russia and their relationship. A large part of the Ukrainian population also could not go along with this. And people who objected, like those in Odessa, were summarily herded into a labor union building, which was boarded up, and they were burned to death. So that's a bit of the history which has not been allowed to be discussed. But what is really at stake is the blowout of the transatlantic system. And those of us, and it's a very large number, frankly, but not so many with the solutions, which is the threat that the Schiller Institute poses. But those of us with the courage to expose the truth about this are a threat because frankly, most people have a sense that they're not being told the truth. And because the transatlantic system is thoroughly, completely bankrupt, fiddling with the interest rates by the Federal Reserve is not going to solve anything. And the only thing that will serve to remedy the situation is if the leading powers of the world, namely the United States, Russia, and China, can come together to address this. And I would just finally add that Nancy Pelosi is engaged in a very nasty provocation of China, threatening to fly over there to Taiwan. She is not welcome. I understand from some Chinese Americans that many people in Taiwan wish she would stay home. They don't really want to have an exaggerated crisis going on between China and Taiwan. They certainly don't want a nuclear war over their territory. And we're now talking about the PLA, the Chinese military, escorting her plane and US military flights to accompany her. So I think this is extremely dangerous. And I think it's part of the same scenario. And what we have to focus on is what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called for, which is that the only way out of this is if these nations can work together to create a new architecture along the lines of a new Bretton Woods system, which respects the security of every nation equally.
There's one question, Diane, concerning this attack from the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, concerning the fact, and this is something that Ritter had actually in a different way raised, a different part of his letter, that the financing of Ukraine that has gone there from the Congress also involves financing government officials, government employees. And what Scott Ritter raises is that funds are being used to employ individuals who are threatening the lives of Americans. What's your view of what Mr. Ritter had to say about that? And further, what do you think about the possibility we're looking at interference of a foreign power in the American elections of the type that's always asserted that Russia's doing?
Well, I think his point is exactly right. I think Schumer, Gillibrand, and anyone else who voted for this legislation, I think the law became something like 117-128, authorizing $8.7 billion to pay for the government of Ukraine, should be investigated. My understanding is that the lawyer who was alone trying to run the Center for Disinformation was basically not funded, and the US government stepped in to pay for her and her to get a staff and everything else. So it seems that we're fully funding this operation. So I think everything that he said, the threat to Americans, particularly the threat to an individual, namely myself, who is challenging Schumer in an upcoming election, as well as a threat to everyone else, and the meddling in elections, myself and Jeff Young, who is here. I don't believe that Rand Paul is up for re-election this year, although he's a sitting US senator, so that in and of itself is pretty egregious. Tulsi Gabbard is the former presidential candidate. Maybe she has aspirations to run in 2024, and she's a former US congresswoman. So this is absolutely outrageous and should be treated as such, and it's probably a criminal offense, and someone should look into whether Schumer should be brought up on criminal charges for doing this.
One final question for you before you go, because we all see that you're in an iconic setting that could be nowhere else than the Bronx, or maybe Brooklyn. It could be Brooklyn. But yesterday, New York City Mayor Eric Adams made a statement that he then retracted. What he said was, "We are in a financial crisis like you can never imagine. Wall Street is collapsing. We are in a recession." Now, later on, he took that back because, of course, that's not what the Biden administration wants people to think. And he then said, the president will make a determination on the official title of where we are. That's the president. And I follow the lead of the president. We're dealing with tough economic times, but we're going to get through it because I trust in the president. Could you say something, given particularly the fact that you happen to be in New York City and you're running for office as well, as to what you think about that statement, why you think it was retracted, and what you think the truth is.
I think he's trying to get money from the federal government to solve some of the problems in New York. I think he's going to live to rue the day that he said he trusted in this president, who is obviously suffering from certain infirmities and doesn't know what he's talking about. The situation in New York City is extremely difficult. The cost of everything is out of control. Believe it or not, rents have begun to go back up to their pre-COVID levels, even though many people still remain jobless or only partially employed. So I would say it definitely doesn't show the kind of leadership that's needed in this crisis, where certainly the mayor of a major city could rally the citizens. We saw that again in Mayor Adams' unfortunate endorsement of that ridiculous public service announcement that was put out a couple of weeks ago about how we can all survive a nuclear bomb by going inside our apartments and closing the windows. I mean, if you're the mayor and you think there's a threat of nuclear war, maybe you should take 1 million people from your city and march down to Washington and tell the Congress to cut it out. I think the safest way to survive nuclear war is to simply not have one. So I think the mayor is going to regret these things. They aren't going to help his popularity. They're really not helping the city. And we have to do something much more in keeping with what Lyndon LaRouche called for in his 4 laws, starting emphatically with putting this whole entire system through bankruptcy.
Okay, so I know that you are involved in some other things and can't stay with us much longer, so we want to thank you for being with us. And we'll be hearing from Jeff Young, I think, a little bit later in our program. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for having me.
And if you're just joining us, by the way, you're watching the LaRouche Organization show for July 30th, Saturday, July 30th, called Suddenly the Truth, Ukraine and the Ibykus Principle. We want to say something now about the title of today's program, which refers to a poem written by the poet Friedrich Schiller, after whom the organization, the Schiller Institute, takes its name. There is an introduction to a reading. We're going to actually play you the poem. There's a reason we're doing this, and I want to first read what Helga Sepp LaRouche has said about this poem and why she values this poem so highly, and why she thought that the Schiller Institute, which is now under attack by people from the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation, why the organization would have the name it has. So here's what she had to say about this poem. I think that the way Friedrich Schiller treats nemesis, and he studied it actually. Do you have the poster for that, by the way? I think that the way that Friedrich Schiller treats nemesis, and he studied it actually in the form of all of the great writers of tragedy of Greece, is as the idea that if you put guilt on yourself, you invite a higher lawfulness to strike you down. You cannot violate the order of creation without that happening. Sooner or later, it's not like an instantaneous response, but sooner or later, it comes. Civilizations which have violated the order of creation over longer periods of time bring doom upon themselves, which is why, if we don't correct the present situation, the idea, for example, of mankind shrinking to 1 billion or 500 million people is an imminent, visible possibility that one can see on the horizon. Why? Because we are violating the laws of the universe in the present political order. Schiller worked on this again and again, but I think that the most beautiful, coherent, powerful way is his poem, The Cranes of Ibykus. In the poem, here he has the murder of a poet, Ibykus. And as the poet is murdered, cranes fly overhead. And Ibykus says, if there is no one to avenge my murder, I call upon you, cranes, to be my vengeance. So this idea is one that then the story unfolds of the poem. And what we're going to do is play the poem, which will be playing in its original German. But what will be projected on your screen is the words to the poem in English. And the idea here is for all of you who may have lost, anybody who's lost hope or faith in the idea of the arc of the moral universe being long but bending toward justice, will be able to see that that happens to be true. That, of course, are the words of Martin Luther King, who talked about the idea that standing up for that which is true, despite opposition, counts for something in the eyes of the universe. And so what we'll do is play the Cranes of Ibykus and then return to our dialogue with Jeff Young and others immediately after this.
Die Kraniche des Ibykus. Zum Kampf der Wagen und Gesänge, der auf Korinthus Landesenge der Griechen Stämme froh vereint, zog Ibykus, der Götterfreund. Ihm schenkte des Gesanges Gabe, der Lieder süßen Mund Apoll. So wandert er an leichtem Stabe aus Regium, des Gottes voll. Schon winkt auf hohem Bergesrücken Akro-Korinth des Wanderers blicken, und in Poseidons Fichtenhain tritt er mit frommen Schauder ein. Nichts regt sich um ihn her, nur Schwärme von Kranichen begleiten ihn, die ferne hin nach des Südens Wärme im graulichten Geschwader ziehen. Seid mir gegrüßt, befreundete Scharen, die mir zur Seebegleiter waren. Zum guten Zeichen nehme ich euch. Mein Los ist es dem euren gleich. Von ferner kommen wir gezogen und flehen um ein wirklich Dach. Sei uns der Gastliche gewogen, der von den Fremdlingen wehrt die Schmach. Und munter fördert er die Schritte und sieht sich in des Waldes Mitte. Da sperren auf getrangem Steg zwei Mörder plötzlich seinen Weg. Zum Kampfe muss er sich bereiten, doch bald ermattet sinkt die Hand. Sie hat der Leier zarte Saiten, doch nie des Bogens Kraft gespannt. Er ruft die Menschen an, die Götter. Sein Flehen dringt zu keinem Retter. Wie weit er auch die Stimme schickt, nichts Lebendes wird hier erblickt. So muss ich hier verlassen sterben, auf fremden Boden, unbeweint, durch böser Buben Hand verderben, wo auch kein Rächer mir erscheint. Und schwer getroffen sinkt er nieder, da rauscht der kraniche Gefieder. Er hört, schon kann er nichts mehr sehen, die nahen Stimmen furchtbar krähen. Von euch, ihr Kraniche dort oben, wenn keine andere Stimme spricht, sei meines Mordes Klag erhoben. Er ruft es und sein Auge bricht. Der nackte Leichnam wird gefunden und bald, obgleich entstellt von Wunden, erkennt der Gastfreund in Korinth die Züge, die ihm teuer sind. Und muss ich dich so wiederfinden? Und hoffte, mit der Fichte Kranz des Sängers Schläfe zu umwinden, bestrahlt von seines Ruhmes Glanz. Und jammernd hören's alle Gäste, versammelt bei Poseidons Feste. Ganz Griechenland ergreift der Schmerz, verloren hat ihn jedes Herz. Und stürmend drängt sich zum Brutanen das Volk, es fordert seine Wut, zu rächen des erschlagenen Mahnen, zu sühnen mit des Mörders Blut. Doch wo die Spur, die aus der Menge der Völker flutendem Gedränge, gelocket von der Spiele Pracht, den schwarzen Täter kenntlich macht? Sind's Räuber, die ihn feig erschlagen? Tat's neidisch ein verborgener Feind? Nur Helios vermag's zu sagen, der alles Irdische bescheint. Er geht vielleicht mit frechem Schritte jetzt eben durch der Griechen Mitte, und während ihn die Rache sucht, genießt er seines Frevels Frucht. Auf ihres eigenen Tempels Schwelle trotzt er vielleicht den Göttern, mengt sich dreist in jene Menschenwelle, die dort sich zum Theater drängt. Denn Bank an Bank gedrängt sitzen, es brechen fast der Bühne Stützen, herbeigeströmt von fern und nah, der Griechen Völker wartend da. Dumpf brausend wie des Meeres Wogen, von Menschen wimmelnd wächst der Bau, in weiter stets geschweiften Bogen, hinauf bis in des Himmels Blau. Wer zählt die Völker, nennt die Namen, die gastlich hier zusammenkamen, von Thesosstadt, von Aulesstrand, vom Phokis, vom Spartanerland, von Asiens entlegenen Küsten, von allen Inseln kamen sie und horchen von dem Schaugerüste des Chores grauser Melodie, der streng und ernst nach alter Sitte mit langsam abgemessenem Schritte hervortritt aus dem Hintergrund, umwandelnd des Theaters rund. So schreiten keine irdischen Weiber, die zeugete kein sterblich Haus. Es steigt das Riesenmaß der Leiber hoch über Menschliches hinaus. Ein schwarzer Mantel schlägt die Lenden, sie schwingen in entfleischten Händen der Fackel düsterrote Glut. In ihren Wangen fließt kein Blut. Und wo die Haare lieblich flattern, um Menschenstirnen freundlich wehen, da sieht man Schlangen hier und nattern, die giftgeschwollenen Bäuche blähen. Und schauerlich gedreht im Kreise beginnen sie des Hymnus Weise, der durch das Herz zerreißend dringt, die Bande um den Sünder schlingt, Besinnung raubend, herzbetörend schallt der erringen Gesang, er schallt des Hörers Mark verzehrend und duldet nicht der Leier Klang. Wohl dem, der frei von Schuld und Fehle bewahrt die kindlich reine Seele. Ihm dürfen wir nicht rächend nahen, er wandelt frei des Lebens Bahn. Doch wehe, wehe, wer verstohlen, des Mordes schwere Tat vollbracht. Wir heften uns an seine Sohlen, das furchtbare Geschlecht der Nacht. Und glaubt er, fliehen zu entspringen, geflügelt sind wir da, die Schlingen ihm werfend um den flüchtigen Fuß, dass er zu Boden fallen muss. So jagen wir ihn ohne Ermatten, versöhnen kann uns keine Reu, ihn fort und fort bis zu den Schatten und geben ihn auch dort nicht frei. So singend tanzen sie den Reigen und Stille wie des Todes Schweigen liegt überm ganzen Hause schwer, als ob die Gottheit nahe wär. Und feierlich, nach alter Sitte, umwandelnd des Theaters rund, mit langsam abgemessenem Schritte verschwinden sie im Hintergrund. Und zwischen Trug und Wahrheit schwebet noch zweifelnd jede Brust und bebet und huldigt der furchtbaren Macht, die richtend im Verborgenen wacht, die unerforschlich, unergründet des Schicksals dunklen Knäuel fliegt, dem tiefen Herzen sich verkündet, doch fliehet vor dem Sonnenlicht. Da hört man auf den höchsten Stufen auf einmal eine Stimme rufen: Sieh da, Timotheus, die Kraniche des Ibykus! Und finster plötzlich wird der Himmel, und über dem Theater hin sieht man im schwärzlichtem Gewimmel ein Kranichheer vorüberziehen. Des Ibykus! Der teure Name rührt jede Brust mit neuem Grame, und wie er Meere, Well auf Well, so läuft zum Munde schnell. Des Ibykus, den wir beweinen, den eine Mörderhand erschlug, was ist's mit dem? Was kann er meinen? Was ist's mit diesem Kranichzug? Und lauter immer wird die Frage, und ahnend fliegt mit Blitzesschlage durch alle Herzen. Gebet Acht, das ist der Eumenidenmacht. Der fromme Dichter wird gerochen, der Mörder bietet selbst sich dar. ergreift ihn, der das Wort gesprochen, und ihn, an den es gerichtet war. Doch dem war kaum das Wort entfahren, möchte er es im Busen gern bewahren. Umsonst, der schreckenbleiche Mund macht schnell den Schuldbewussten kund. Man reißt und schleppt sie vor den Richter. Die Szene wird zum Tribunal, und es gestehen die Bösewichter, getroffen von der Rache Strahl.
That's the poem, The Cranes of Ibykus. If you've just joined us and you happen to come on in the middle, this is a poem that discusses the murder of a poet, but the fact that the murderers are unable to evade their guilt. And the importance of the reason that we chose to make sure that this was shown here today has to do with the fact that because there are powerful forces, some of them associated with the United States State Department, some of them associated with British intelligence, some of them associated with others, who wish to attempt to suppress the uncompromised critique of many Americans and non-Americans of what has been going on in the theater of war, particularly as it involves Ukraine, but also, for that matter, Afghanistan and other theaters. That there's an attempt to try to intimidate those people and even threaten them physically. And that never turns out well for the people that try to do it, because the arc of the moral universe is long, perhaps, but bends toward justice. The idea that there are forces or powers that are not within the domain of control of those with money or those with a certain kind of power. It's always thwarted and baffled the impotent, the intellectually and morally impotent in history. And so we're in that kind of a situation as we speak today, but it's also one which is hopeful, because in fact, such actions would not be happening unless the truth were in fact beginning to be seen, not only appreciated, but be acted upon. Now, to continue the dialogue on that we started a bit earlier, and again, if you just joined us, you would have missed perhaps Diane Sayre, who is an independent candidate for the United States Senate in New York State, and who spoke to us. She's one of the people that appeared on the blacklist that was issued by the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation. What we're going to do here is to sort of broaden the dialogue and take it beyond just that particular incident, sort of following along the pathway of the poem you just heard, to look at the broader context of all of this. And so what we're going to do is hear from three individuals right now. Joel DeJean, who is an independent candidate for Congress in Texas, I think in the 38th Congressional District, if I'm correct. Jeff Young, who's an independent candidate, I think actually won his Democratic primary, is that right, in Kentucky? Or are you independent?
Democratic primary.
Yes, but an independent mind. And Kirk Wiebe, who many of you have seen on our platform before, formerly National Security Agency for a period of about 30 years, and a person who is close associate with several of the people that appeared on the list, among them Ray McGovern, Scott Ritter, and others, through the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. So what I want to do first of all is go first to Joel and have you, Joel, tell us a little bit about what the broader context is, inclusive of the kind of fight that you find yourself in for the truth down there in Texas. You just did an event, which I think we are going to have a chance to tell people a little bit more about as well a little bit later in the program. So go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Yes, I had two chances this week to see that the First Amendment is not universal in this country. First, on Monday, I went to a town hall meeting called by Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher, that is, who's in the next door district, District 7. And she was holding a live town hall meeting on gun control related to the recent shootings. a couple of months ago in another town hall meeting, I had busted up the atmosphere of her meeting, exposing her as a total hypocrite, because while she was demanding that we take the weapons away from the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists in this country, this was right after the Buffalo massacre, she had just signed on with all of her Democratic colleagues in the Congress and most of her Republican colleagues. She had signed on to send $40 billion to a bunch of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And I told her, how can we trust your wish for peace in this country when you're supporting war and terrorism all over the world, not just Ukraine, but Iraq, Syria, Libya. And she proceeded to say, oh, thanks for your question. And then she proceeded to filibuster and go to the next. This time, when I rose my hand to speak, she made sure I was not given the microphone. And she had the head of the police, the chief of police in Houston at the meeting. And this again was on arms control, or getting arms away from these crazy youth that are shooting up schools and supermarkets. And at the point where the chief of police of the city of Houston was pointing towards me to get the next question, Lizzie leaned over and yanked his chain, and they went to somebody else. So that's the freedom of speech we have in this country. But if you're gonna hold a town meeting, you gotta hold your own. So I held a virtual town hall meeting on Thursday, July 28th, with the most preeminent meteorologist in the country today, Dr. Neil Frank, who is in his 90s. He was the head of the National Hurricane Center in Miami for 13 years. Throughout the 70s and early 80s. In 1987, he became the chief meteorologist for a local TV station, KHOU, here in Houston, and he was there for 20 years. And over the years, I've read his opinion pieces, which had appeared periodically in the Chronicle, where he was pointing out the flaws of this CO2 global warming voodoo cult. He didn't call it that, but I call it that. And after Harvey, which occurred 5 years ago, I remember seeing a piece in the Chronicle by Dr. Neil Frank where he showed that this type of heavy rain is not because of climate change. It occurs periodically. And ever since then, he has been banned from appearing in the local newspaper. So much for freedom of speech. But during our town hall meeting, I gave an overview on how this whole push for clean energy, for renewable energy, is a total fraud, and coming from the energy capital of the world, Houston, and being pushed by the Houston mayor, Sylvester Turner, and most, not all, of the city council. This is a total disgrace. And Joe Jennings and I had testified last February, about 18 months ago, to the city council and to the Houston city mayor, warning them that we were heading towards brownouts and blackouts if we continued with this renewable energy push. They ignored the warnings, and 6 days later, Texas entered into a freeze, a death freeze that killed almost 1,000 people from freezing and carbon monoxide poisoning and other events related to the storm. Now, this brought down the whole electric grid in Texas, and we were told we were minutes away from a total shutdown, which would have required weeks, if not months, to bring back up. So you think they'd learned a lesson, but a week later, not even a week, Sylvester Turner appears on the Sunday morning talk show Face the Nation and goes on to say, see, the Texas freeze is proof that global climate change is real. So he's a total buffoon. And their solution is to put more windmills, even though the windmills we have now, we have 30 gigawatts of wind power, supposedly, capacity in this state. And during the freeze, 10% was available, less than 3 gigawatts. Same thing happened this summer. We have 30 gigawatts capacity when the highest heat and highest power requirements occurred in the afternoon. We had 10% of the wind power available. So I pointed out that this is a total fraud. We have to go towards nuclear, keep using fossil fuels, and eventually go to fusion. And then Dr. Frank came on and said, I agree with you. And then he proceeded to go through how the fraud of CO2 is a total lie. And he proceeded to give a comparison to using football as a metaphor, which is very useful here in Texas, which is a football mad state. And he said that comparing CO2 in the atmosphere to a 100,000 seat football stadium, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is 40 seats out of a 100,000 seat stadium. Nitrogen is over 70,000, oxygen about 20,000. So he proceeded to show that we've had cycles every 1,000 years of heat, cooling, embedded in a 10,000 year cycle of ice ages. So his 15-minute presentation is a refutation of this CO2 cult. And he then pointed out that CO2 is very useful for plants and that nurseries, greenhouses, when they want to grow things, they pump CO2 into their greenhouses to the level of 1,200 parts per million. It's 3 times more than the 400 parts per million we have now. So we was very happy to get that out. At the end, we pointed out that he is not allowed, like I said before, to even publish an opposing opinion in our great democracy and in our great energy city here in Houston. So that was a very useful intervention. It's on my Facebook page, Joe DeJohn for Congress, and also my website. So we hope to have more of these town hall meetings, and I hope to do more so I can get on the hit list also.
Well, actually, what we're going to do is a little bit later in the program, Joel, is we'll be able to show almost the entirety of Dr. Frank's presentation once we've heard from our other 2 guests. Jeff, you did get on the list. And as you mentioned, you are a Democratic, you've run the Democratic nomination there in the state of Kentucky. How do you think you got on the list? How do you feel about being on the list? And what do you think about the idea of the list?
Well, I feel honored to be named as a purveyor of Russian propaganda by an organization and a government, the Ukrainian government, that lies all the time. Nothing they say can be believed. I lived through the 9/11 attacks on our country and the frenzied campaign to go to war after those attacks. And the propaganda was really bad then. But I have never experienced anything as bad as the propaganda in our mainstream media corporations, TV, newspapers, radio, everything, that started on February 24th, 2022, the day that Russia launched its special military operation against Ukraine. No propaganda campaign I've ever experienced has been as bad as the one that started then and is still going on today. Now, every so often I look at my local newspaper, the Lexington Herald Leader, and almost every day they reprint an AP article or something from the Los Angeles Times about Ukraine, it's invariably 99% propaganda, anti-Russian lies. They simply leave out the Russian perspective. All they report is what the Ukrainian government says, President Zelensky says, and that's always false. So I'm honored to be on the blacklist, sponsored by a government that lies 24/7, 365.
Thank you for that. I was leaning back thinking about what you were saying. Because it's important that be kept in mind, that business concerning 9/11 in particular. In fact, if you wouldn't mind, what I'm going to do is to bring Kirk in, because as many may not know, Kirk and Bill Binney and friends of theirs like Ed Loomis and others found themselves in a very, very extraordinary situation at that time in 9/11, which caused them to have to challenge everything that they had assumed to be true up through then. But also because, Kirk, you're a Russia expert. You've been looking at and spying on Russia. You had that as an assignment. You clearly found yourself willingly in an adversarial position to Russia, yet you have expressed full dissent with what is right now going on and what's being said about what's going on. So we'd like to go to you and just have you say something to our audience about your view of what has happened with the blacklist, also what's happening with this war, and also the deeper matters, the background matters that got us to this point.
Yes. Good afternoon to my colleagues that are appearing with you, Dennis, and to you. Let me begin with a headline. This whole matter of this organization and this hit list is obviously an initiative of the United States. The Ukrainians are simply a pawn, paid off well, and so they salute. The Ukraine has no logical reason or rationale to target people of the LaRouche organization or anyone who takes on the Ukraine and points out facts about a man named President Vladimir Putin, who is simply trying to hang on and represent his country so that it survives in a complicated world, made more complicated by NATO's insistence to encroach on Russia's borders. So I see it as an initiative of the US to promulgate a senseless and dangerous war. Now, I took the time to take the Andrei Shapovalov article that you shared, Dennis. He is the head of the Center of Combating Disinformation. I looked up the sponsors of that organization. As you pointed out, you mentioned the US State Department as one, but also the National Security Service Academy, the US Civilian Research and Development Fund, and in particular with respect to Ukraine, the CRDF, that's the acronym for that, in Ukraine. Now, what I want to point out is this is an organization that was established and funded. It was actually funded by Congress in 1992 and established by the United States National Science Foundation in 1995. Now, the first thing I noticed in the Shapovalov document, this brief piece talking about LaRouche people, Schiller Institute people being information terrorists. Listen to the words, and I quote, The participants discussed the methods used in Ukraine and abroad, as well as the legal basis and features of interaction between civil society and state bodies to counter fakes and disinformation in the context, and here's the key, cyber security. Now, don't take that lightly. This is supposed to be the central focus of this organization. And they admit to it. Now, when I look up the definition of cybersecurity, just so that others are clear, the US government defines it as follows: the art of protecting networks, devices, and data from unauthorized access or criminal use. In other words, it concerns the electronic transmission of data. We usually call it the internet. Now, has LaRouche or has Schiller ever promulgated the idea of hacking to achieve its goals? Obviously not. Not one iota of evidence. And so this whole list is a farce in the context, well, by any measure, but clearly in the context of wherein they met discussing cybersecurity. So it is a farce on the face of it. Now, it's interesting. Do you remember that DHS of the United States government, just what, 4 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, attempted to stand up a disinformation board or propaganda board, something like that. They even appointed a lady to head it up, but the pushback was so great that they abandoned that notion. But they revealed their intent. What better way to exercise that intent than to go to Ukraine, stand up a board, pay off a couple of Ukrainians to nod their head and go along? So the way I view it, this attack on LaRouche, on Schiller in particular, these people on that list is sponsored by the US government itself.
Okay, so now that we've established some things about this, which become very interesting, especially given the the present circumstance, let's expand it a little bit. Therefore, to the electoral process, because we've got two candidates who are on with us here, Kirk, and one that you know well. Diane's not there at the moment. So now you have worked in cybersecurity, Kirk. You might want to say just a bit. I know, of course, many programs you have done this, just so people have a sense of your background in a moment, and just give me an idea of what kind of implication the fact of what you just said might have both for these candidates and for the violation of these candidates' constitutional rights.
Oh, I don't think. Oh, with all due respect, I'm not sure these two candidates realize the threat of the insidious initiative that surrounds us in this country. What you see happening is coordinated and it's purposeful. Yes, you can yell and scream about AOC and what she says and does, but that's not the real story. The real story is that the United States and all of its assets are being controlled by a group of people who want to decide who succeeds and who fails on any number of stages. The political stage and the election process is another example. They have ways, and we've seen as more information comes out about 2020, People have no shame. If you can buy off people who really have no principles other than to worship money, and unfortunately, there are many such people amongst us, they will actually work to follow through on any command, any request, legal or not. So when our candidates go out and talk to the people, all the while the, quote, enemy for truth, the enemy of fairness, those who want to control are busy subverting their ability to deliver and follow through on an honest message. And that is the horror that walks among us. That is the elephant in the room. I'm not calling it Republican. I'm not calling it Democrat on purpose. I'm calling it corruption. Corruption in spirit, corruption in principles, corruption, period. And that is the most frightening aspect of this time in which we live. We have one chance to fix it.
Yeah, before I request to get any response from Joel and also from Jeff, let me just ask you to do one thing, Kirk, because I don't think most people would not know that you yourself, Bill Binney, Ed Loomis, Diane Rourke, were the subject of an investigation, were raided, and then that investigation was caused to be dissipated at a certain point. And you might want to say just why that happened to you, what the reasons were that such an investigation was brought, why it evaporated, and how does that circumstance indicate the kind of capabilities that could be deployed?
Yeah, this goes back 20 years, gentlemen, and audience as well, ladies and gentlemen. In 1999, 2000 framework, the NSA set about to modernize itself in the face of the digital explosion. I'm not going to go into that. We're all aware of how communications and everything changed with the internet and all of the different applications and capabilities. Well, NSA conducted a massive, the biggest planning effort. They brought in industry, they brought in government people, including myself. I was part of that exercise. We developed a plan for NSA to achieve what we called then information dominance in 10 years. If they would have done it, it would have come to fruition about 2009. But it was a big task. And the way funding works, we knew it had to go over multiple years. It couldn't be a herky-jerk if you really wanted to do it. Now, they really didn't do it. They threw our plan out. It was okayed by every technical expert at the agency. But the head of the agency, Michael V. Hayden, said, nope, this isn't my vision. This is not what I want to do. And so he started his own program. Now, about the same time that happened, a shocker came. NSA turned its sophisticated monitoring capabilities against the American people. It began to collect data about Americans without their knowledge. Now, the Congress set up what I call a red herring called the FISA court. The FISA court is weak by any definition. It's basically one-sided, and they almost approve every initiative of the government. So it's the right hand scratching the left hand's back. It's a farce. Totally outside our Article 3 system of justice and courts. So they go ahead and they begin to monitor. Binney and I and a handful of others, Ed Loomis and Diane Rourke, who was actually in Congress, part of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, we got together as a group and said, what are we going to do about this? This is prohibited by law. It violates the Constitution in every respect. In every respect. How do we deal with it? And we decided we had to work through accepted channels. She was in Congress. She went to Porter Goss, the head of the HIPSI. He did basically nothing. We tried to contact the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That didn't work. We went to the Pentagon and wrote a letter to the Inspector General. They began an investigation. And they found out that the solutions that we offered were better, more robust, and I would add, though they did not say this, more protective of the legitimate rights of the average person. In other words, we demanded an Article 3 process, our traditional respect of accuse and defend, and the right to a hearing and a jury of your peers, to be the way to do that. And we worked out a way to do that, but nobody wanted to do it because information is the key to everything. You know, a former operative, colonel in the Stasi of the East German police said, boy, I wish we had what the Americans have, meaning the US government. They had 72 kilometers. If you lined up all the folders in a row, they had 72 kilometers. Imagine what that is. What is that, 45 miles? Of manila folders. They didn't live in the digital age. They did it by hand, but they had dossiers on every human being in East Germany. Now, when you have that kind of power, number one question, why do you have it? Why do you need it? To dominate the population, to head off people who might want to speak the truth, whether you're a candidate for office, some academician, Dennis Speed in some organization, Mr. LaRouche himself. In any case, we know the government will spy on Americans. That's why we have 2 intelligence committees, because of the incident back in the 70s where the US was caught spying on US Vietnam War protesters, spying on Martin Luther King, spying on any number of people on Wall Street, spying on Senator Frank Church himself. And that led to, quote, a solution to oversee what NSA and others were doing. Unfortunately, that oversight is toothless. It's toothless. It amounts to a report once or twice a year where someone comes in and briefs those who are appropriately cleared. That in itself excludes most people in Congress. So we talk about the gang of 8. Those people are cleared, but it's 8 of our elected body of Congress who can know the truth, but the rest can't. So what kind of representative government do we really have? So this is a handshake, a wink, and a nod. Yeah, you guys are doing well. Yeah, we'll fund you. Don't worry. There is no true oversight in Congress. And so we had to, you know, when you look at your options, if the government you work for is against what you are concerned about, the Constitution, freedom of speech, and fairness and truth, then you got a problem. You got to get out of the government. We did. Thank God we were old enough to retire. They threatened to take our pensions, but they didn't do it because we would have gone to court, and they didn't want that to happen. They didn't want to hear or put into a court transcript what we would have said. So they usually try to leave that alone, buy you off or whatever. Well, we had no grounds to sue, so we simply went out and began to broadcast our message publicly and inform the American people. But to this day, I would tell you, Dennis, and audience, that this story is still not broadly known. It's known in certain corners where people basically pay attention to what's going on, but there are so many people so busy with raising families, going to work, and just trying to survive, they still don't know about this. And so the biggest threat is not Russia. The biggest threat to freedom and the Constitution and our civil rights is not China. It's us. We need to clean house in this country or we're doomed.
Okay, very good. So we're getting some questions in and so on, and we could go to those. But first, let me just ask whether or not, Jeff, you'd have something. I'll go to you first, and then we'll come to Joel. So if you have anything to say in response.
Yes, a couple of things. One is that the last 5 minutes of comments by Kirk were extremely on target. The Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unlawful searches and seizures, is completely shredded, no longer exists in this country. And I'm thankful for all of the efforts of Kirk and his colleagues in trying to expose all that and publicize it to the American people. Now, I am not a member of the LaRouche organization. I'm not a member of the Schiller Institute, but I agree with you on many critically important issues. And I certainly am outraged by the abuses by all of our, many of our intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, the NSA, the FBI. Over the decades, the CIA was founded in 1947. And ever since then, it has been the worst terrorist organization in the world. From 1947 till today, been the largest, most powerful, more powerful than East German Stasi, more deadly, because it operates in every country. And so one of the planks in my platform, running for Congress in Kentucky, is to abolish the CIA. And I will also look very hard at the NSA, certainly propose cutting its budget substantially, so it just won't have the resources to spy on every American, which is totally unconstitutional and contrary to its charter.
Okay, very good. Joel?
Besides the intelligence agencies and the brain-dead committee members in the Congress, we have the news media. I'll take the example again of the Houston Chronicle. This is the paper that endorsed my Republican opponent, former West Point graduate Wesley Hunt, who was proud of his service in killing Iraqis in Operation Iraqi Freedom. He's proud of being a diplomatic liaison to Saudi Arabia, which is the country that financed and supplied the hijackers for 9/11, which gave George W. Bush the excuse to start these wars, 20 years of continuous war in the Middle East. But the Chronicle, instead of listening to Dr. Neil Frank and listening to scientists and engineers who know a little bit about electricity and power production and what's needed for a safe grid, this week they endorsed the Biden administration call for putting hundreds of thousands of additional wind turbines. Since the ones on land have proven to be such failures, they say, oh, well, we'll just put them out in the Gulf of Mexico, 24 miles offshore. And this monstrosity has been endorsed by the top labor union official here in the Houston area, by the Houston Chronicle, and most of the congressional delegations, including Republicans. So besides getting rid of some of these intelligence agencies, we have to break up these monopolies that control the news media, both print, radio, and televised, and internet in this country.
What you just said leads me to want to do one thing now. I think if we can do this, if we have available the video of Dr. Neil Frank, because I'm thinking, and the reason would be this. What I think people will find in viewing this is it's not a question of whether you agree or you disagree with Dr. Frank. You will not be able to deny after seeing the video that he has very thoroughly thought out his viewpoint. And the idea that you are going to stop people like that from not merely, quote, expressing that viewpoint. You know, people like to be kind of, no, you don't want to stop people like that from advocating. It's very important that people advocate because the issue is not a question of who's right or who's wrong. The issue is to try to arrive at a higher conception of what the direction of the country is going to be, sure, but also a higher conception of how to know the truth. If we have that, I'd like us to view that now, and if that works, yeah, very good. So we're going to go to that, and then we'll come back. There are several questions actually, which we're going to give to people. So.
Pick up a little bit. You indicated that in that February freeze a year ago, that the wind power was not blowing, was diminished. Okay, the reason for that is there is no wind. When you have the coldest temperature settled over you, a cold front moves through. Here comes this big dome of cold air, sits right over you. There's no wind. The same thing happens in the summertime. When you have this big ball of hot air sit right over you, and now we need air conditioning, there is no wind. So the instability of wind is amazing. And I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't even be talking about a $1 trillion Green New Deal. What a tragedy, because carbon dioxide, the data shows that carbon dioxide is not a major factor in the Earth's temperature. Now, I'll come back to that, but I want to start with a statement here that even skeptics believe that the Earth has warmed over the last 175 years. That's true. There's no question that it's warmed. The question that can be debated is what is causing that warming. The alarmists would have us believe that it's carbon dioxide generated by burning fossil fuels, driving your SUV, for example, and this carbon dioxide is what is causing the Earth to warm. Now, the skeptics say, no. The data shows that carbon dioxide is not a major factor in the Earth's temperature, that the Earth temperature changes because of natural cycles. So I'd like to spend just a minute talking about natural cycles. You know, the Earth's temperature follows cycles. The longest cycle we're aware of is the Ice Age. Ice Age lasts 100,000 years, separated by a 10,000 year warm period. And that's where we are now. We're right in the middle of this 10,000, well, we're not in the middle, we're at the end of the 10,000 year warm period from the last Ice Age, and we're headed towards another Ice Age that could be decades, centuries away, but I'm telling you, it is going to occur. So there is a cycle, 1,000-year cycle, long term. Now, if you look at the 10,000 years, there is another cycle. This cycle is 1,000 years. Every 1,000 years, the temperature peaks, and that's where we are right now. We're in the peak of this 1,000-year cycle. 1,000 years ago, the Earth was warmer than today, and they farmed into Greenland for 400 years. 2,000 years ago, the Roman period, was warmer than today. 3,000 years ago, warmer than today. 7,000, 8,000, the temperature was 2, maybe 3 degrees centigrade warmer than today. The point I'm trying to make is there are cycles. Then if you go back to the last couple of 100 years, there's a shorter cycle. That would be a 60-year cycle. In other words, the Earth warms for 30 years, and then it cools for 30 years. So let's go back to the last 10,000 years. Every one of those peaks involve a warming like we are experiencing right now. We have a warming to that peak. So we've had 10 warming periods over the last 10,000 years. That's what I mean by a natural cycle. Now, the alarmists would like us to believe that man is causing all this problem. And it's interesting that Mark Levin wrote an interesting book on the media. And he has one chapter there on forming public opinion. And he said, particularly when the event you're trying to sell isn't true, he said you can do three things. You can lie about it, you can omit certain critical information, or you can use propaganda. And it's interesting that he uses climate change as an example of propaganda. Now, I want to go back to the omission and get back to this carbon dioxide thing. When was the last time anyone emphasized to you that carbon dioxide was a minor gas? It's not 10% of the atmosphere. It's not 5% of the atmosphere. It's not 4% of the atmosphere. It's not 0.4% of the atmosphere. It's 0.04 of the atmosphere, 400 parts per million. Let's put that in perspective. The football stadium at Dallas holds 100,000 people. If we assign a molecule of air to every one of those seats, there would be over 70,000 nitrogen seats. There'd be over 20,000 oxygen seats. Do you know how many seats there'd be for carbon dioxide? 40. And I don't think 40 is going to control the atmosphere in a football game in Dallas, nor do I believe that 0.04% of the atmosphere, 400 parts per million, is going to control the temperature of the globe. And yet that's what we're being told. And furthermore, there's a very poor correlation between carbon dioxide and the Earth's temperature. Let's go back 10,000 years. Remember, I told you every 1,000 years there's a peak in the temperature. If carbon dioxide was responsible for that, then we should see peaks in the carbon dioxide levels. They're not there. There's no peaks. So we went through natural cycles. And as a matter of fact, if you take a look at the last 10,000 years, what the alarmists are telling us, when the carbon dioxide increased, the temperature increased, the opposite occurs. At the beginning of this 10,000 year period, the Earth was warm and the carbon dioxide levels were down around 240 or 250 parts per million. Then gradually the carbon dioxide levels increased to the end of that 10,000 year period to 280 or 290. At the same time, the temperature decreased, the opposite of what you're being told. Now let's go on a shorter time scale. Let's go back to, and carbon dioxide started increasing right after World War II. And right at that time, the Earth was in a cold cycle. Remember, I told you the Earth had a 60-year cycle, warm versus cold. So from 1940 to 1975, the Earth was in a cold cycle while carbon dioxide was increasing. The opposite of what you're being told. As a matter of fact, there was great concern among all the experts that we were headed towards an ice age. As a matter of fact, they had an international meeting of all the experts in the world, and they became so concerned that they sent Nixon a letter and said, start saving food because this cold is going to destroy the agriculture. And then the Earth went into its warm cycle at the same time that carbon dioxide was increasing. So in the 80s and 90s, there is one 30-year period where there's excellent correlation between the two. And then in 1998, the Earth went into its cold cycle and the temperature just plateaued off while the carbon dioxide continues to increase. Now, the point I'm trying to make you is over the last 10,000 years, there's only been one 30-year period in the 80s and the 90s when there was excellent coordination between carbon dioxide and the Earth's temperature. And all the alarmist statements were generated during this period of time, and those alarmist statements still carry on today. It's amazing. In the last time, let me make one more point about carbon dioxide. When was the last time you heard anything positive about carbon dioxide? Plants love carbon dioxide. As a matter of fact, if plants don't get carbon dioxide, they all die. If the carbon dioxide levels drop below 180, that would be 18 seats in our stadium. All plants die. and all human beings are going to die. In the last 10,000 years, the carbon dioxide levels have been barely above that level, in the 200 range. That's kind of scary. At times, the carbon dioxide level would drop down to that point. So this is pretty scary. So what is the optimum levels of carbon dioxide as far as plants and as far as human life is concerned? Nobody can give me an answer to that. But I'll tell you what, the people that run nurseries have an answer. For the last several decades, in nurseries that could control their environment, they pump the carbon dioxide levels up to 1,200. That would be 120 seats in our stadium. Now, you don't ever hear anything about that. Satellite pictures would show that in the last 30 years, there's been a greening of the planet, some 20 to 30%. We need to get this information out to people. One final point that I'd like to make, alarmists would like for us to believe that we are the one responsible for all of the problems. They've zeroed in on 5 meteorological parameters, and they said all these parameters are increasing in frequency and increasing in intensity. Let's go down through the list. We're seeing increasing droughts. No, we're not. The government has been keeping track of droughts since 1919, and there's been a gradual decrease in the number of droughts. Nothing today compares to what happened in the Dust Bowls of the 30s. How about wildfires? Oh, we're seeing an increase in wildfires. No, if you take a look at the data from 1926, the government has published the data showing the acreage that is burned by wildfire. And I'm telling you, before the World War II, I mean, it was bad, even bad in World War II. Then in the late 50s and the 60s, there was an immediate downturn. And I asked some foresters, I said, what happened? I said, well, we introduced some very effective programs that saved the forest. But in the 90s, the environmentalists got involved and they made us stop using some of those programs. And there has been an increase of the damage from wildfires. Or how about sea level? By the year 2100, New York City, Miami Beach, Galveston will all be underwater. Well, we've been tracking the sea level rise since 1855. The sea level is rising at the rate of 8 inches per century. Let me emphasize that, 8 inches per century. And 8 inches is not going to flood New York City. Or how about the earth is the warmest it's ever been? I saw an article a year ago that said this decade was the warmest temperature that has ever been measured on the earth. And furthermore, this is the second warmest decade in record. Now, what they don't emphasize to you is the records only go back to 1880. And measured means it was measured by a thermometer. And they started the records in 1880. I have no reason why they did that. If you take a look at the distribution of weather stations in 1880, it is frightening. So what was the temperature? Well, we really don't know. And so the temperature record as determined by thermometers is pretty shaky in terms of the first part. But now I've already told you, let's go back 10,000 years. Every 1,000 years, the temperature has been warmer than today. They've lied to you. Well, how about storm? Do you know if you define a tornado as a violent one with 160 mile-an-hour winds, and they've been tracking these since 1950, there is a substantial decrease in the number of storms, and in 2018, there was 0. Oh, how about hurricanes? Worldwide, we have hurricane-type storms. In the Pacific, they call them typhoons, and in Australia, they call them cyclones. There's about 47 of these a year. There's been a 5 to 10% decrease since 1980, and we've had good satellite pictures over the last 40 years, so we feel fairly confident about that. There's been a decrease in the number of hurricane-type storms over the last 40 years. They've lied to you. There's no question about it. So what's driving this whole thing? Well, let me read you a statement here by Morris Strong. He is a millionaire out of Canada. And Morris Strong said, isn't the only hope for this planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? And it isn't our responsibility to bring that about. And then one of the senior officials at UN, a German, said, we redistribute wealth by climate policy. We've got to get over the notion that climate policy is an environmental issue. I believe that the real push behind this is a world and international effort to bring about a Marxist one world government. And I appreciate the stand that you're taking.
Now, by the way, just to say, I made sure that we included his conclusion, despite the fact that there may be people that don't agree with that. Matter of fact, I don't agree with that particularly. However, what's relevant here is that nobody, I think, can deny the thorough composition of what he presented. For that not to be heard, and not to be allowed to be heard, is, of course, a violation of the rights of the people of the United States, implicitly, because here's somebody who clearly knows their field, is making his knowledge available to people. And of course, you have the right, the opportunity, etc., to counter that, critique that, refute that, or accept it. And so I just want, yes.
Dr. Frank's presentation was painful to listen to. So I want to ask you, do his views, which sounded to me like an Exxon lobbyist, represent the views of the LaRouche movement or the Schiller Institute or not?
That is an excellent question. That is a really, really good question. Okay. There's a quote, if I can find it here. I just have that's funny. Yeah. This is from something that Lyndon LaRouche wrote called The Science of the Human Mind. One sentence. He said, and he asked this: how is universal truth defined with certainty, and what are the human mind's potentialities for ordered progress in discovering universal truth? I'll read that again. How is universal truth defined with certainty, and what are the human mind's potentialities for ordered progress in discovering this universal truth? What got us into trouble, what has from the very beginning of this organization, way back when it had it's gone through many different forms, got us into trouble was the idea that there was no view. As such, there was a method of inquiry, there was a method of discovery, and there was a method of refutation. Now people called it in the old days the dialectical method. Then Lynn said, yeah, that is what it's called, but it's the same thing that Plato did. As some people know who've looked at philosophy, Plato is famous for not having any theory. There's no theory of knowledge of Plato. Aristotle's got one. Other people have them. Kant had one. Hegel had one, but Plato didn't. And so the reason I put it that way is that, and that's exactly why I showed it. I didn't know that, and let me say, you said something very important. It was painful to watch because you think that essentially he has clearly a point of view that's at least congruent with Exxon or other people. I'm saying,
well, with propagandists.
Well, yeah, but here's the issue. In Ukraine, okay, we have an official saying that we are propagandists for Russia. And then you have people, but listen how it works, right? If you go to MSNBC, people will talk about the people on Fox who are propagandists, right, for the crazies in QAnon, they'll say. Or if you go to...
May I just reframe this section of our discussion in terms of what are the worst problems facing humanity today? I do not think global climate change...
Wait a minute, you did interrupt me when I was... Let me conclude. What I'm saying because
Go ahead.
this was not about climate. This was about showing him at this point precisely to demonstrate what the problem of suppression of these kinds of presentations does. See, the issue is that people have got to decide that they are going to listen to things that they find painful, wrong, etc.
Of
Hear
course.
those things out, right? Hear those things out. And then, having heard them, then you have, well, we call it the coincidence of opposites. We've talked about this several times, that there are areas of agreement or areas of inquiry that get agreed upon that you then can in fact promote. So
Okay.
That's
So-
what I.
Great. If you finish, then I'd like to say a little bit. I think the
No,
two
go ahead.
worst problems facing humanity today are the imminent threat of a nuclear war arising out of conflicts such as Ukraine, provocative actions such as the planned visit by Speaker of the House, Democrat Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan. That could set off a nuclear war, could set off World War III. I think that's the greatest danger facing humanity. The second greatest danger, as I see it, based on a lifetime of research, is environmental destruction. And climate disruption is a part of that. It's hard to say exactly how big a part, but that would be number 2 on my list of threats to humanity. I would say the danger of a nuclear war is about 100 times worse than the danger posed by environmental destruction, climate change. I could be wrong. Maybe it's only 10 times worse. But speeches like that given by Dr. Frank, which again, they sounded like a lobbyist from Exxon, self-interested, interested only in profit for the oil industry, are not helpful in addressing either the danger of a nuclear war or the danger of environmental destruction that makes life makes much of the world uninhabitable for people and would lead to a die-off. Now, nuclear war could lead to complete 100% die-off of humanity, complete extinction, and extinction is forever. Climate environmental destruction would lead to a die-off, very severe, but it would not eliminate all humans from existence. I'll stop there.
Dennis, if I can respond, since I invited Dr. Frank.
Yes.
Yeah, he came at it from decades of weather forecasting, knowledge on climate. I come at it from having worked in the infrared detection and targeting systems for a major defense contractor. And I know from the instruments I worked on that the largest absorber of infrared radiation is water vapor. 95% of the greenhouse effect, which is what makes life possible on this planet, is water vapor. CO2 is a minor component of absorption of infrared. The reason why we have the James Webb Space Telescope in space is because its detectors are looking for long wave infrared radiation from deep space. And that infrared radiation is absorbed by water vapor in the atmosphere. The other thing is that when the sunlight comes in, the visible light, our atmosphere is transparent to visible light. When that visible light interacts with the earth and the oceans, it is re-emitted at a lower frequency and a longer wavelength, infrared radiation, which is emitted towards space and is blocked by water vapor. So why do these environmentalists who claim that CO2 is the thermostat for the world's climate not admit that the most powerful greenhouse gas is H2O, it's water vapor, because they're lying to you. Like Dr. Frank said, they are pushing a lie. And in that video, the part where I went through with a climate scientist at Rice University at the James Bacon III Institute, I told that climate scientist, Daniel Cohen, that I was born in a country with the lowest carbon footprint in the entire Western Hemisphere, Haiti. 75% of the power in Haiti comes from charcoal, and 90% of the power in the Democratic Republic of the Congo comes from charcoal. Where does that come from? Burning trees. Slow burn of trees produces charcoal. So all this concerned about CO2 emissions, look, Exxon is pushing to do carbon capture and storage in the Gulf of Mexico. They are willing to take billions of dollars from people who think the CO2 is killing the planet to bury it in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's not Exxon telling Dr. Frank what to say, and they certainly aren't telling me what to say. So there's a lot more to the climate than CO2.
By the way, okay, Kirk, you go ahead and go ahead.
Yeah, let me just say, I've been listening very carefully. I'm an intelligence analyst, so I have to weigh data. So I find it fascinating to hear these 2 points of view, 3 if you listen to Dr. Frank. But I am certainly not a scientist. I am not a climatologist. I'm not a geologist. But I've had a little bit of exposure to form a respect for the discipline of science. And so when the gentleman from Kentucky, the good candidate for Congress, and I hope you succeed, talks about nuclear as the nuclear confrontation is the #1 concern. Clearly, I agree. But I would not put climate as the second. I would put corruption as the biggest challenge. Why do I say that? Nuclear confrontation is a thing of mankind. It's in his realm to do or not to do. Corruption is a thing of man. He can do or not do. There's choices. Climate is more of a thing of science. We are still learning about planet Earth. We have so much to learn. And if the process of science itself is corrupted, a thing of man, then we lose a clear foundation of truth. Now, I have always believed science is about observation, measurement, detection, discovery, data, honest data. Unfortunately, corruption modifies data. We've already found professors in various schools modifying data, withholding data to bias the outcome of some study involving climate. So I'm kind of neutral at this point. I think there ought to be a summit, just like we're calling for a summit in Schiller to avoid a catastrophic cataclysm, if you will, involving nuclear weapons by putting forth an agenda of economic development and security for all nations. We need a climate summit where science, and only science, is put forth. No human No human manipulation. We need, in other words, aren't we talking about truth again? We have to de-muddy the water, put the facts on the table, and stop the political maneuvering. We need to do that, or we are not going to progress, and we will simply create greater animosity that people will eventually try to solve through detrimental means of expression. That can be war, it can be lying, it can be subterfuge, it can be, expressed in many ways. Man is weak, and unless man is humbled enough to say the truth is paramount, I don't care what the subject is, truth must be the way ahead. That's all I wanted to add.
Okay, we're actually trying to get a video so that we can escalate from here, because this is exactly why. This is the true nature of the LaRouche organization. When I say that, I realize this is supposed to be a program on which, by the way, I'm not supposed to be speaking. So let me just get back to there's some questions which that people have brought in. But I will also indicate that as soon as we can, we go, oh, wait a minute, we're ready? We got the video ready? Okay, because since we're talking about the question of nuclear, we figured let's go nuclear. So we're going to bring in Lyndon LaRouche here on the question of environment and climate. So let's go to him.
We live in an earthly biosphere. Biosphere is organized in a certain way. I happen to know a good deal about it. Spent a great amount of my life on this particular question. The biosphere depends upon higher states of organization, and it depends upon an increase in the amount of energy organized in a suitable form available per square hectare and per unit weight of biomass. When you turn the clock backward by simply depleting rainforests, as they did in Brazil, as a result of U.S. and international financial institutions' policies, beginning the 1960s, the Brazilian rainforests, and then later with the help of the liberals in this country and the Volkswagen Corporation, for example, extended to the Mato Grosso today, the rainforests of Brazil were looted. The land was turned into a desert in the areas that this was done. The area is spreading. The amount of land area lost in Brazil every year is equivalent to the size of a state of the United States annually. As a result of this in particular, one of the great weather systems of the world, the Brazilian Amazon system, decided to move from its usual parking place over the Amazon basin. It moved out into the South Atlantic. This happened in the early 70s. It was a ping-pong effect on the entire world's weather systems. As a result, we've had problems ever since then. Similar policies were done in other parts of the world. When we put land into reserve without maintaining a cover on agricultural land put in reserve, we are destroying the environment. We are changing weather patterns. When we insisted that the sub-Saharan states increase the rate of taxation on grazing farmers, they overgrazed the land and helped to spread the desert, sub-Saharan desert, destroying entire regions. We cut down, or Japan did that in Indonesia, an entire island's wood supply in a rainforest. This happened to be situated in a location which is one of the most powerful catalysts for the world weather system, especially the monsoon system of South Asia and Southeast Asia. That was done. India, the average temperature in Fahrenheit degrees in India has risen about 10 degrees in the post-war period. Why? The cutting of trees as fuel for wood, for cooking. Why? Because of those who were opposed to a high technology orientation for the development of India's agriculture. So that is what we're doing to nature. We're not, this would mean what? Increasing the density of energy. Where we should have a policy, very explicitly. Where we write gigawatts of energy today, we have to say in 2 generations from now, we write terawatts of energy. Very simple. We can do it if we are determined to do it. We can increase the potential population density of this planet in the next 50 to 60 years by a factor of 10. If we used all the technology we had at the beginning of the 1970s and applied it freely on a global scale to all people, including infrastructural technology, this planet could sustain between 15 and 25 billion people at a standard comparable to that we used to enjoy in the United States when times were much better about 20 years ago. When we all had a better living standard. With what we have available, we can increase that standard of living by a factor of 40 to 50 times in terms of productivity over the next 2 to 3 generations. We have the means in hand to do so if we're so determined. That is, if we were to take the attitude which the United States had under the Kennedy space program, or it was actually the Eisenhower Kennedy space program from about 1958, the so-called Sputnik, post-Sputnik program, to about 1965. If we maintain that, combined with policies of investment tax credits for investments of a suitable kind, with a science enrichment program in our schools and similar kinds of things that we did then, nothing more than that, I can assure you that knowing what we know is important to work upon in science, in technology, knowing the kinds of projects which are the best way to express these technological improvements, I assure you that if mankind on this planet had the political will to do that, we would increase the potential population density of this planet at a higher standard of living by a factor as much of 40 over the days. Next 3 generations, a factor of 10. We could sustain, by the end of this century, or the end of the 2 generations, we could say we would be sustaining a potential population in the order of magnitude of 100 billion people. More comfortably, much better fed, much more secure, much freer, much less crowded than today, because we'd use land more intelligently. So there is no objective reason why we have to put up with this nonsense.
So while I am not proposing an immediate discussion of that matter, in that context, we have some questions which will be a little bit easier to answer than that. However, this is for also the audience, because we've been getting various responses audience-wise, and now people are very awake, and that's very good. But there were 3 questions that people had, and I want to pose them to the panelists. This one is going to go to you, Joel, because it's from a contact from Africa who is asking a very particular question. How should Africa view the recent Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov's visit to Africa and the U.S.'s Blinken's planned visit to Africa? is the continent safe from the effects of the current Russia-Ukraine showcase? That's the first part of the question. And then it has a second part, which was directed directly to Schiller Institute, the Rouge organization, etc., which was, can the organization propose to convene the UN General Assembly so leaders discuss peace solutions to Ukraine? So it's sort of all one piece. So that's the first question. I'm sort of going to put them all out there so people can think about it. There's a second question, which is from Sarah, and I'm going to give this to both Kirk and to Jeff. It's a general question, but you want to think about how you want to answer. I just feel that there are those few behind the scenes that are deliberately keeping all this going. Who do you think they are, and how can we go after them? So that's her general question. So I wanted to pose that to you, two of you. There's then a detailed question that I might we may have to actually just refer it. I mean, I can answer it, but it's about a very particular thing done on Friday by federal agents who executed raids at multiple locations of members of the Uhuru movement in St. Petersburg, Florida. The group was raided because of alleged financial ties to a Russian national named Alexander Ionov, who is accused by the U.S. government of working with political groups to inflame political discord and spread disinformation. So this is a story that just developed last night, basically is very specific. So that's, I mean, if somebody wants to take that question, I have no problem. I can give more details. But let me go first to you, Joel, for that answer to Menashe, and then we'll come to both Jeff and Kirk for the answer to Sarah.
First, an answer to our friend from Africa. All African nations should welcome Foreign Secretary Lavrov and welcome Russia's invitation to electrify the continent. Now, as far as food, we have to ask ourselves, why is Africa dependent on wheat from Ukraine and Russia? The African landmass could incorporate China, all of Europe, the United States, and India in the African continent. They have river systems. The Congo that I mentioned could develop hydroelectric power to the tune of 40 gigawatts. That's 40 times more than they have available today. So Africa needs development and not blowhard speeches from people like Blinken, and Blinken shouldn't even be welcomed by any of the governments on the continent. He should be sent home packing.
Well, Joel, if I could just briefly say, I totally agree with what you just said. I agree 100% that Africa should be welcoming visits from Russian government and from the Chinese government. It's they have a strategy of development that is a win-win strategy, not a colonialist strategy like Europe, not an imperialist strategy for Africa like the United States. And so we're in total agreement on Africa. Thank you, Joel.
I agree with your comment.
Great. Exactly. No, and I'm just laying back because this is exactly what should be happening, a kind of dialogue among the people. So if either of you have anything to say to Sarah for her question, which is a kind of it's a question a lot of people say. I don't believe everybody, there's a few people who sort of keep this thing going. What do we do about this? Yeah. So who wants to?
Kirk, you want to start? Kirk.
Yeah, I'll begin it. And you can tie the ribbons on it, Jeff. Yes, it's a few trying to dominate the many. But those few have powerful positions, powerful influences. And Schiller points to them all the time, as I'm sure Jeff or Joel does. But a very select few actually run the global financial system. Money, without money, nations cannot borrow on credit. They cannot invest in improved methodologies. As Lyndon LaRouche said, we need the best of science, the best of technology to solve some of the issues affecting the agricultural and economic well-being of nation states. We need to do that. We're not. We're wasting billions on other stuff that really shouldn't be necessary. The Russia-Ukraine example stands out currently. So, yeah, welcome Lavrov, welcome China, welcome anyone who honestly, it's an important word, honestly wants to share information to help you better yourself. Don't give me food, teach me how to grow food. And that is the correct way to view this. But to answer the question more specifically, yeah, there's an oligarchy, you could call it, across important processes that we as humans engage in: finance, economics, shipping, transportation, name it, energy production, that control these key threads of human existence that are vital. We're talking about basic needs, and they're controlled by the few. That paradigm has to be broken. We need to rise above personal interest, personal gain, beyond reasonable levels. Some of these people are greedy beyond belief for power and money. I don't understand what a human being would do with over several $1 million. I really cannot imagine it. I could certainly live very well on 500,000. I've never made 500,000, to be honest. So I'm a bit of a humble pauper, but I can tell you a very few control. And we must find a way. We must find a linkage across humanity, countries, nations, organizations to unite on this common good and omit the corruption, omit the self-serving agendas, and then we'll make real progress.
Okay, very good. Jeff?
All right. Yes, I think that question is answerable. I think it's an excellent question. Who are the few behind the scenes? Now, I'm going to restrict my comments to the few behind the scenes in the Western countries: United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia. And so in the 1950s, a social scientist named C. Wright Mills wrote a book called The Power Elite. He focused on three groups: top-ranking military officials in the United States, generals and people of approximately that rank. I guess he included the very wealthy, the billionaires. I'm sure there were billionaires even in the 1950s. There are many more today. And what was the third one? Possibly the media. I can't remember the third group that he was focusing on. So, and he estimated there were something like 5,000 people who control the United States. Today, more recently, there was a book published called The Deep State, and it was a serious attempt to analyze who exercises the levers of power today. Wall Street was one. the military industrial complex, which includes the weapons manufacturers, were another dominant group. Silicon Valley, this author mentioned, because they control basically IT research and social media. You know, Silicon Valley is the home of the biggest social media platforms. Certainly the intelligence community is part of the power elite, the CIA, the NSA, certain members of Congress, but not all of them, the people on the financial services committees, the defense appropriation committees, intelligence committees, you know, certain strategic committees are part of the power elite. And it's not just the United States, it extends across the Western world. Now, in the rest of the world, in which the rising powers are China and Russia, the number of people who can influence their policies is much larger. So in that sense, Russia and China are much more democratic than any Western country. The power is much more concentrated in Western countries than it is in China, Russia, India, the rest of the world. So overall, I would guess, I don't know, there are probably 10,000 or so people in this group. Most of them are not behind the scenes. Some of them are, but most of them are right there in the open. We know who the 450 richest Americans are. They're on the list. So good question, and I think there is an answer to it.
Very good. What we're going to do on that last question is I'm going to just take it and probably answer it separately. The reason being that it has to do with a very specific incident that occurred. And these incidents are linked to the attempt to argue that there are, Russian impact in American politics and people being cultivated by Russia to oppose Ukraine. And that sort of just began coming out. Now, we don't think there are coincidences in the world, so we'll leave it at that. But both for time reasons and also because I think we've clearly answered a lot of things. What I'd like to do now is give each of you a few minutes to say whatever you'd like to say, sort of as a summary or anything that hasn't been brought up that you think is important for us to discuss. I'll also pose sort of a broader question as we go to the end, which is, fine, we've talked about some things here that are negative. We've talked about this issue of Ukraine. But then there's the question of the actual orientation that the candidacies and all of us as citizens can take, which supersedes all of this and leaves all this behind. It doesn't mean that I'm asking for necessarily a big optimistic moment or something, but rather I'd like you, as you all give your final remarks, if there's anything that you've got to say about what you think the direction of the future has to be, please go ahead and do it. So I think I'll start with you, Kirk.
Yeah, well, I'll keep it short, Dennis, because the answer is really fairly simple, although it may not be obvious. But I call it coming together. And what I mean is you can sit in place and fight the conundrums that face you daily, or you can devote most of your time to cultivating alternative paths. And that brings me to Schiller Institute and LaRouche. Because of the principles, and I point out to the audience, Schiller and LaRouche do not hide their principles. They're clearly stated. In fact, they put them out there purposefully in order to gain your hopefully your respect and your help in furthering the cause of mankind along peaceable lines. And so I think what Schiller is attempting to do, and I think is succeeding in doing slowly, it's going to be a long trek, but we are bringing people into the discussion, and people are joining at an increasing rate. And anytime you can get people, especially a multinational audience, to come together, are we not, in a default way, discussing perhaps even higher goals than those, say, discussed at the United Nations on a daily basis? I think the kind of audience Schiller brings to the table is certainly more grounded in the reality of day-to-day life, and in that sense represents a truer sense of what the pulse of the world is as we recruit more and more people and more people participate. So again, I've said it in the past, I'm not jumping onto LaRouche or Schiller for political reasons. I actually embrace what they stand for. And I'm eager to share those things with others and hope we can come together with a common good, with ideas for a common future that does not emphasize military conflict, but emphasizes national security for all nations through economic development.
Thank you for that, Kirk. And Jeff, I'm going to go to you. But before we do, I just want to thank you for being on and point something out, which is very important. You know, there are a lot of people on that list. There are another 40 people on that list. And those people do not agree with us on, you know, or some of them do. I mean, some of them probably do, but they're very, very different. And some people just said straight out, look, I'm on that list because of what I did, right? And they had things they had done. Scott Ritter, for example, is very well known for what kinds of critiques he's had. And certainly a guy like Ray McGovern is not, you know, he's on that list for a lot of reasons. And you're being here, and you're, which is, and even for that matter, in the Schiller matter, I deeply appreciate that. I think we all appreciate it. We know what this means. It's very important, because what we're trying to do and has to be done is that the wall has to be broken, in which people are able, who clearly have divergent points of view, to talk, not merely to, quote, cause them to converge. Maybe that's not the thing that should happen. Maybe what ought to happen is clarification and maybe arriving at a completely different view, which are the kinds of things that can only actually happen in the trenches of a real dialogue, in which you're going to have sparks. You're going to have that kind of thing. You have to have it. So I just wanted to say that, you know, because I might not have said it otherwise.
All right. Thank you, Dennis. And I definitely appreciate your ability to moderate discussions. I've always been impressed by that since, you know, a few months ago when I first saw you moderate another Schiller Institute conference. I appreciate the opportunity to interact in a serious way with anyone. So I thank you all for that. I think the greatest threat right now is a nuclear war started by the United States out of a kind of nostalgia for the days in the 1950s when the United States was the only superpower. After World War II, the United States was pretty much the only country left standing. And instead of cooperating with the rest of the world to help it develop economically, the United States made a fateful decision to try to destroy the Soviet Union, our ally for 4 years during World War II and destroy socialism everywhere in the world, and set out in a very methodical way to try to gain influence and economic leverage over as much of the world as they could. So to me, the worst thing in the world is Western imperialism. Imperialism wants to enrich its own billionaires even more and exploit everyone else. It's a hateful ideology. It arises out of the workings of corporate capitalism. So as long as corporate capitalism has existed, let's say since the late 1800s, we've had imperialism. And it tries to acquire and exploit everything it can. So right now, this empire is collapsing in real time. The United States and NATO, which started the war in Ukraine, not in February 2022, but in 2014, when they fomented an illegal coup against the government of Ukraine, that's when the war started. And in my view, the aggressors and the villains have been NATO, the United States, NATO, and the Nazis in Ukraine that were supported by the United States. They attacked ethnic Russians in Donetsk and Lugansk. They started this war in 2014, and they're going to lose it. The West is going to be defeated in Ukraine comprehensively, and I think that's a good thing. Russia and China are proposing, and many of the world's other countries are proposing, a multipolar world order, and as opposed to a unipolar system whereby the United States dominates everything. That system is doomed. It's collapsing. It may collapse within the next 12 months. It's that close to falling apart. Now, I have plenty of legislative proposals. For example, ending all of our economic sanctions against every country and every individual in the world where we have sanctions, eliminate all of those. That might save the US economy. If we don't eliminate the sanctions, we're in for a permanent depression, possibly a breakup into 50 or more warring states, and the destruction of the United States as we know it. Or worse. I mean, we could start a nuclear war, which would end it for humanity. So we're at a critical point in the world's history. Western imperialism must disappear, or certainly this country will have no chance, no future.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. All right, Congressman DeJean.
Jeff, thank you for your comments. I will say what saved the 1950s from Western imperialism was Sputnik. And a lot of us were born in the 50s, me towards the tail end. And NASA turned 64 yesterday. And NASA was the right response to Sputnik to lift our game. Now, on the negative side, as far as who runs the world, I would add the British royal family, the Saudi royal family. These are the viruses that have contaminated the world for thousands of years, that tradition. It would be better for England to eliminate the monarchy, and we should certainly not tie the United States policy to this dead, dying corpse called the British monarchy. Now, on the positive side, what do we have to look forward to? Just look at the reaction to the images from the James Webb Space Telescope. And I did see Diane Sayre's symposium. I had to catch it this morning because I was at a Shakespeare play yesterday. But you look at the reaction to these images, and you combine that with the fact that there is a great radio telescope right there. All it needs is a few $1 million of repairs at the center of Puerto Rico. And that has been a magnet to educate and inspire young Puerto Ricans that they have a future in science. And if you listen to that symposium, you get an uplifting vision of what the world should be working on. We should be working with China. We should do whatever it takes to take Russia back into the International Space Station, and maybe we can bribe them by lifting all the sanctions like you recommended, Jeff. So we have a bright future, not just on Earth, but we have an extraterrestrial imperative. We need to go back to the moon. We need to go to Mars. But more important, we need to give young people in this country, in Africa, in Haiti, and around the world a vision that they have a place in promoting the future of mankind. And that's what I hope to do with my campaign. I know that's what Diane is going to do with her campaign. And hopefully we can bring enough Americans to realize that there's no future in war with Russia or China. Maybe we should go back to the traditions of John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt.
All right. Kirk Wiebe, Jeff Young, Joe DeJean, I want to thank you for being with us today. I want to thank everybody for being with us in the audience. I want to thank Diane Sayre, who was with us earlier, and thank our technical people, Dave DeBroat. We never talk. Thank these guys. Jose Vega, who's not with us at the moment. And just say, concerning what we've been talking about, we began by our program by this idea that, the sudden truth appears, and we called it the Ibykus principle. And then we talked about the poem about the poet who had been killed on his way to a festival where he was going to recite his poem, and how the cranes above him were appealed to by him to avenge him. And Joel just said something very important concerning the Webb telescope. The fact that, for example, there are 200 to 400 billion stars just in the Milky Way galaxy alone, and there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. And you look at the kind of thing that Webb is allowing us to see, keeping in mind that we have had two aircraft, the Voyagers 1 and 2, that have left the solar system, been traveling for 45 years, although they were supposed to be originally a 5-year mission. And so when we consider those larger goals and missions of mankind, clearly there's something in the human race that rises above the kind of petty and worse than animal treatment that we have of one another. War is an expression of that. And turning off the machine of war, the $1 trillion machine of war in the case of the United States, in favor of a cooperation that emphasizes this higher or better angels of mankind's nature. That is the task, and that is the method, that's the mission, I think, that most Americans actually agree with. So whatever you may think about the particular persons that appeared on the blacklist that was produced by Ukraine, the fact is that those independent minds, in the way in which they are critiquing this circumstance and saying, no matter what anybody thinks, no, war is not the answer. We are not going to support it. And there is a higher principle. And that is what we are basically represent. So I'll put it this way, in thanking everybody for being with us today, that truth and justice, whether we're talking about the cranes of Ibykus or we're talking about the James Webb Telescope, is often just above our heads.